Good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick. I'm the VP for Counseling for HS2 Academy. So tonight, our seminar is going to be focusing on analyzing trends for early action and early decision from this past application cycle. So I'll be going through some trends regarding early admissions. I'll also be talking about some of our case studies from some of our seniors from HS2 this year, so that we can glean some trends and some things that we can look at that you can perhaps gain some insight into the process and what could give you an edge in the process for this coming application cycle. All right, so first of all, I do want to take a quick look, though, at the UC system in terms of the acceptances for that one. The UCs, as you probably know, don't necessarily have early action, early decision. In fact, they've only had one sort of like admission cycle, which is just their regular decision cycle. But I wanted to take a look because they recently just released the total number of applications. Typically, it takes the UCs several months. Normally, the actual admissions information, like the acceptance rates, won't really be out until later in the summer, typically July or August. But at least what we can do is if we find out how many applications there were this year, we can do some prediction because the typical accepted classes tend to stay very similar in terms of the number. So in previous seminars, I've done this before, and almost always it's very close. It's less than 1% difference between the predicted rate and the actual rate. Oftentimes it's only like a 0.1 or 0.2 difference. So we can take a look at this and hopefully be able to see kind of what the acceptance rates have looked like this year. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the top end of the UCs. As you can see here, I've kind of color coded these so that if you see a red percentage, that means it decreased from the previous year. And then if it's blue, it actually increased from the previous year. So as you can see here, the predicted UCLA acceptance rate is probably not going to be very different unless they drastically reduced the incoming class size. All right, so as you can see here, it's almost exactly the same because the actual number of people who applied, it's very, very similar. You're only looking at maybe like about 400 people difference. So the acceptance rate will probably stay, just sub 9%, right? So very close to last year's 8.76%. Now for UC Berkeley, it actually peaked a little bit, right? And that's because the number of applications decreased slightly. This is, of course, predicted. Like I said, this is based on the assumption that they're going to be accepting, the same number of people as last year. Now, that could vary slightly. Of course, could go up, it could go down a little bit. So our best bet is to just go ahead and just use last year's as sort of a predicting placeholder. So if it stays static, you're looking at a slight increase in Berkeley's acceptance rate. Now, for the mid-4 UCs, we can see that, for the most part, except for Santa Barbara, which peaked slightly, the other UCs have decreased here slightly, but not by much. As you can tell here, they're all within a percentage point, right? So Irvine, San Diego predicted to have very, very similar acceptance rates to last year, maybe like a 0.5, less than 0.5% decrease for Irvine, and a little bit more for San Diego. Davis, though, is predicted to go down by close to 2%. So there we have a little bit more substantive increases there. Okay. Some other trends that we can see here. I guess the biggest predicted decrease is actually, interestingly, UC Merced, right? So the baby of the UC system, because it was the newest one that was created maybe like 20 years ago, used to always have like something like close to 100% acceptance rate, like anywhere from like a 98 to a 95% acceptance rate. This year, or last year, it went down to about 93%. And this year, this is going to be really interesting because the number of applicants to Merced is increasing too, especially in light of the fact that the UCs are getting harder and harder as a whole. So more people are going ahead and checking off the box and going ahead and applying to Merced anyway. So if the incoming class size stays the same, you could very well see a drop to down to about 81% or 82%. Okay, so that's actually kind of substantial there because UC Merced used to be considered like the safety UC. You're more or less guaranteed to get in. So this could actually be a pretty dramatic year where, yeah, about 1 out of 5 people may not even be able to get into the UC system, even if they put Merced as their backup school. Okay, so it just goes to show that the entire UC system is getting harder. Some trends that we can actually kind of glean from this as well. So as you can see here, normally we're used to seeing the acceptance rates go down, right? So every single year, a percentage point or two every single campus, right? So in a way, it's kind of a nice reprieve that the acceptance rates have somewhat plateaued a little bit, so they're not decreasing as quickly as they used to in previous years. So it just, I guess, goes to show that, yeah, over the last year or two, and this is also the case with a lot of private schools, last year was kind of a record year. There's maybe a little bit more caution on the part of students applying. It could be to like due to uh, some factors like maybe some people are choosing just not to apply to college, or maybe taking a gap year, or maybe deciding that, hey, you know what, there's a movement now in industries to go with a skills-based approach instead of having to rely on a college education. There could be a number of factors at play here, but regardless, we are seeing a decrease. We're not seeing the massive increases year by year as we did when the pandemic first started. Okay. Some other trends have more or less remained the same here. The top UCs like Berkeley and UCLA have still tended to favor in-state applicants, right? They're getting a slightly better acceptance rate. I just wanted to kind of show you the previous slide again. So as you can see here for Berkeley, yeah, it's actually like quite huge, right? So it's a 15% versus the overall predicted 11% are getting in from in-state applicants. For UCLA, it's kind of close, but you would still see that there's this slight preference here for the the in-state population for the UCs or for UCLA. Now, conversely, the mid-tier UCs are actually seeing some favoritism here for out-of-state students, and in some cases even international students. So if we take a look at the middle group here, as you notice here for UC Irvine, it's 46% for out of state versus 25 overall. So that's pretty substantial, right? That's almost double the acceptance rate if you are from out of state, if you're from out of California applying to the UCs. Not as much of a gap here for UC San Diego. It's still 31% versus 24%. Still pretty significant, obviously, but not quite as dramatic as like for UC Irvine. So from other schools as well, you could see like for Santa Barbara, 34 versus 28. For UC Davis, 56 versus 40%. So I think those are pretty telling. And I think that if you are from out of state, right, if you are from outside of California, you should definitely consider applying even to these mid-tier UCs. And I think in large part because many people from out of state tend to only apply to Berkeley or UCLA because those are the ones they're familiar with. But I mean, especially if you're really into some really popular majors like computer science or engineering, fun fact here, every single UC except for Merced has a top 60 computer science program, right? So all these other schools like UC Irvine, UC San Diego, Santa Barbara, if you're interested in some of the more popular majors right now, like computer science or engineering, it would do you well to go ahead and to apply to more UC campuses, especially if you're from outside of California. Okay, so that's definitely a trend you're going to want to pay attention to. Okay, and then of course, UCLA is still the most selective campus in California, especially as it continues to be the preferred destination, mostly for California applicants. Interestingly, there's not that much of a difference in terms of the number of applications from Berkeley and UCLA as far as out of state and internationally, but there is a huge difference here if you take a look at the numbers from this year. So 92,000 for California applicants to UCLA versus 72,000 for Berkeley. So I guess it just goes to show people in California maybe have a preference for the LA region. I guess it does make sense if you visited UCLA, right? The Westwood campus is really pretty. It's like pretty close to the beach and everything. It's a little bit more sort of like updated, and the campus environment around it in terms of Westwood proper is definitely more scenic than, let's say, for example, what's around Berkeley. Berkeley is definitely more historical, but obviously, some students might prefer, some newer kind of environments and newer shops and stuff. So that might have something to do with it, actually. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to go to the core of today's presentation, which is taking a look at trends in early admissions. So a lot of this information came out within the last few months, especially when the early results came out in December. So this is really the first opportunity we had to really analyze these things over the last couple of months and be able to kind of take a look at and see major trends that are going on right now. Interestingly, there are a couple of articles from Inside Higher Ed and Forbes that actually cite the Common App research brief that came out which talks about some of the data from these last few early rounds, right? So one of the key things that we can get from this is that there is actually an increase even just within last year in terms of the total number of early action and early decision applications between last year and this year, right? So between last year and this year, it increased by 12%. So that's actually a really huge 1 year increase in terms of the number of early applications. It's actually getting to the point where some admissions people are starting to call the early round or early action, early decision round as the new regular decision, right? Because it's getting increasingly popular, right? So it's even more stark if you compare it to pre-pandemic levels, right? So the application year right before COVID, so 2019, 2020, if you compare that to this past fall for fall 2023, the number of total EA applications or EA-ED applications based on Common App has risen by 41%, right? So that's pretty massive, right? And in large part, this is driven by a surge in the number of minority applicants. This is for underrepresented minorities who are applying to these schools. Since the Supreme Court decision, it actually increased by 67%, right? So that's partially what's driving this total increase in the number of applications, right? An interesting trend that we note here is that there are a lot more people applying to early action schools and early decision schools for public institutions. There was an 82% increase since 2019 versus private institutions, which is still pretty big, but 47% increase, right? So the prevailing theory at this point is that the increase in applications for public institutions is largely cost driven, right? Because for the most part, state public universities tend to be cheaper than private institutions. So it tends to show a little bit more favoritism towards those schools, okay? I think in large part, it's also just the sheer numbers. This is not something that the articles mentioned, but it's also in large part of the fact that many public institutions have a pure EA option as opposed to ED. So oftentimes what people will do is they'll just apply to multiple EA schools along with an ED school, right? Because there are really no restrictions in terms of how many schools you can apply to. So in theory, someone, who used to maybe apply to an ED school and then maybe apply to one or two EA schools to pair up with that, maybe now we're seeing more people applying to 3, 4, or even 5 EA schools in addition to their ED school, okay? All right. So also, given the incredibly low overall acceptance rates, it is then strategically advantageous to consider applying to an EA or ED school for your top schools. And one of the key trends that we're noticing here too, to support this, is that colleges are actually increasing the number of freshmen or the percentage of their freshman class that they're accepting in the early round, right? As we can see here, so for many of these schools, this is just a select sample size here, but for many of these schools, they're really touching upon like half of their freshman classes being accepted in the ED round, right? So Brown at about 52%, Columbia at about 53.6%. There are certain schools like Emory, for instance, at almost 62%, really. So more than half of their incoming classes are being selected in the early round. MIT is actually kind of interesting in the fact that it's actually slightly going down, but it's still really staggering that about 63% of this year's freshman class is coming from their early action. Okay, so it just goes to show that there's a lot more people who are now aware of the advantages of applying for early and are then choosing to apply to these early schools. So it's definitely good to like sort of keep up with that and really try to do your best to research these schools, especially now, right? So I would highly suggest if you're a current junior, don't wait until the summer to go ahead and research which schools you can apply to for early. You can very well start doing that now, because once the Common App goes live on August 1st, typically that gives you a window of like a couple of months, right? 2 or 3 months before the deadline's around November 1st. And the sooner you can get started with the process, the more of these early applications you can apply to potentially, okay? All right, so it's also important for you to strategically select your applications, right? So oftentimes you want to do some research, try to figure out what the current acceptance rates are. So this is from this past fall. It's a comparison between last year's acceptance rates and this year for a select group of EA and ED schools. So as you can see, for the most part, many schools have decreased a little bit, but in some rare cases, some schools actually increased in terms of their acceptance rates. But I would suspect here that it's not because they're getting looser in their standards. I think it's because they've strategically decided to kind of like increase the number of students they accepted in the early round a little bit. That's kind of what I'm seeing for Brown, for instance, where, the number of applicants more or less stayed the same, but they deliberately accepted slightly more students than they did from last year. And this is most definitely true as well for USC. USC last year, it was the first year that they decided to do early action, and it was just a shocking 6%. That was largely because the number of applicants increased. But this year went up slightly, right? 7.2%. And that was largely because there was a slight increase in the number of admitted students. Okay. But by and large, we see the trend continuing here where it's a slight decrease. Like MIT doesn't really change much. It's always hovering on that 5% or high 4%. So even this is just a minor fluctuation for them. But for some other schools, it's a little bit more pronounced. Like Duke became really more popular last year. So it actually went down by about 3.5%, right? So that's a trend worth noting there, right? Okay, now one of the key things to look at here is I often get asked the question, is early decision really that big of an advantage, right? Keeping in mind, of course, that, for early decision, oftentimes people say like, yeah, I mean, people get recruited, the early decision round is a little bit more competitive. Is it really as good as people say it is? And if you look at the straight numbers here, it's actually, in many cases, like you get this idea that it's probably like double or even triple. If you really take a look at the RD only rates, which is the rate of the people who are accepted in the RD only rate, not counting the early round, this difference becomes even more pronounced, right? So for instance, Harvard in this given year, this wasn't from last year necessarily, but I just wanted to give you an example of this here. So Harvard, if their overall acceptance rate was 3.4, you look at that 7.4% EA rate and you think, oh, it's about double. Well, if you look beyond that and you're actually comparing it to the RD only rate, which is at really about 2.6%, it's more than double. It's actually more close to triple at that point, right? It becomes even more pronounced here for the ED schools. For EA, yes, it's a considerable boost, but if you start comparing it to the ED schools like Brown, Dartmouth, Cornell here among the Ivies, for instance, you'll note here that it's probably hovering to about 4 times, right? The advantage of applying for ED versus RD only is probably averaging about 4, right? So in some cases for Dartmouth, it's almost hovering towards like 5 times as good as the RD only rate. So that's pretty staggering, right? It just goes to show that it is actually a huge advantage for you to be able to apply to and hopefully get into the school for ED.